Kyla Tienhaara is an assistant professor in the School of Environmental Studies and the Department of Global Development Studies at Queen's University, and a visiting fellow at the School of Regulation and Global Governance at Australian National University. She's the author of Green Keynesianism and the Global Financial Crisis, and the co-editor of the Routledge Handbook on the Green New Deal, which is a book that I find absolutely essential for thinking about the potential social benefits of decarbonizing the economy and rethinking growth in a time of climate breakdown. She's also one of the few researchers looking closely at the function of investor-state dispute settlement as an international legal apparatus that largely protects investors from the pushback that they might receive from states. There's no way I could quickly summarize what this work deciphers in terms of the obscure nature of the global legal structure that it identifies, but not a lot of people I've spoken with have any knowledge about it. They might understand in the abstract that there is a system of global capitalism that is protected by the codification of laws that largely protect profits and private investment over, let's say, the safety or autonomy of communities, but this is the actual system that serves that. And Kyla is uniquely insightful about how it works and what it's set up to prevent. I wanted to underscore at the top here that we engage in this conversation with the concepts of utopianism and pragmatism in climate action. That's not a disclaimer so much as an invitation to ask yourself where you sit in relation to this idea that abolishing fossil fuels is utopian, or to kind of request that you sit with the question of whether it's too much to ask that the economy be democratized or energy be regarded as a source of social wealth rather than a source of capital. It's maybe worth thinking too about why it is the case that there's a legally binding international law or legal structure that protects fossil fuel companies from reprisal, but no binding law to protect the planet from the forces that are exacerbating our mounting climate emergency. What history precedes this moment, where it's primarily rich countries that benefit from existing laws and international treaties, while poor countries get poorer? And what mechanisms or modes of resistance exist so that we can funnel our collective outrage at these legally sanctioned systems of upholding inequality into something real? In her book, Ending Fossil Fuels, which I reference a lot on this podcast, Holly Jean Buck writes about talking to you about your research. The question that Buck is left with after talking with you is, how does one fight something so shadowy and dispersed? Your work is about what Buck calls the obscure legal structures by which much fossil fuel investment persists in spite of, all kinds of energy being put into phase out, basically. That's one big part of your research. And, I actually encountered your work first through this book, and I found it interesting that there were a number of reflections in it on the phrases that are commonly used to describe this race to stabilize the climate, like phase out, for example. You both talk about the language of stranded assets.
Yeah.
Buck's sense is that there's almost a degree of pathos in that phrase, these poor stranded assets, that just does not dovetail with the gravity of it. I wondered if you wanted to explain just fundamentally what stranded assets means, why it's an important concept, and what some of its maybe valences are from your perspective.
Sure. So stranded assets is just basically the idea that as we move towards a different type of energy system in particular, you can have stranded assets in other areas, but I usually talk about it in terms of energy systems that, the traditional sources of energy and the investments that have been put into those traditional sources of energy, so coal, oil, and gas, and all the investment that goes into extracting those fossil fuels out of the ground, but also transporting them in pipelines, and then all of the associated infrastructure that goes along with burning the fossil fuels, getting them to the customers and burning them. So power plants, gas stations. I mean, you can think of lots of different types of infrastructure that are implicated. But basically, if we want to shift away from those sources of energy, and do it rather quickly, because I mean that's the key element here, is that we can't just phase out suggest something that's very gradual. And maybe if we had started acting on climate change when we first realized it was a problem, then we could have phased out. But now we need something very rapid in terms of a transformation of our energy systems. That means that investment that's already been made into infrastructure, into extractive projects, is not going to be recouped in the form of profits, and this can happen for economic reasons, or because we make political decisions to end things before their economic life would be fulfilled. So, to take a more concrete example, if you look at a coal power plant, that it can have an economic life of 30 or 40 years, but if you built one in a country like the Netherlands, in the past decade, and then the government comes in with a more rapid phase out of coal power in order to respond to demands and indeed court rulings about the need to address climate change, those plants can no longer operate for their full life. So part of that investment is going to be stranded. That's the idea. And then with fossil fuels, we've been spending all of this money exploring for oil and gas that we can't afford to actually take out of the ground. So the investments that have been made in looking for those fossil fuels would also be quote unquote stranded.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, thanks for that. It does provide a kind of more concrete picture, but it also underscores the fact that like the speed, right? The speed of it, because the severity of the crisis like can't be overstated.
No, definitely not.
Your report, for example, for the International Institute for Environment and Development, with I think Lorenzo Cotula, talks about how emissions began rebounding as soon as lockdown restrictions were eased in the wake of COVID-19. And that put the world back on the path of 3 degrees Celsius or more of warming by the end of the century. There's no end to the negative impacts of that pathway. Doing away with fossil fuels in time, you say, will require more serious supply side measures than what is currently like on the table. I wondered if you could give us a sense of a few of these supply side or upstream measures to curtail greenhouse gas emissions, and maybe also speak to why, despite the fact that most oil and gas reserves are on public lands or in offshore deposits within the control of a state, the existence of investor-state dispute settlement as like a legal structure threatens to block a lot of these supply side measures.
So a lot of the climate policies that we typically talk about, especially here in Canada as of late, but in a lot of countries, are focused on things like carbon taxes, which are meant to sort of shift consumption away from fossil fuels by making it more expensive, and incentives in terms of like giving people rebates on electric cars, or grants to help retrofit their homes to improve energy efficiency and adopt renewable energy and so forth. So these are focused more on the consumers of energy than on the producers of energy. However, I mean, one of the big problems we have here in Canada is that just getting the oil and gas out of the ground is actually the largest source of emissions in the country before it's even burned. If you added that in, then it would be overwhelming. So there's been a lot of attention in recent years to the fact that we need to focus more on trying to stop the continual production of fossil fuels, because the companies are not behaving as if there is going to be a phase out of fossil fuels. They continue to look for new reserves. They continue to exploit the ones they have. They don't have plans to phase out voluntarily. And so a lot of countries are looking towards things like moratoria. The first obvious step is to stop giving out any licenses to explore. But basically, even if we cut off exploration, we still have too much carbon in the existing assets that are the ones that are being developed, or at least have some kind of license covering them. We can't afford to burn what's in those. So there's going to have to be also some efforts to retract licenses that have been given out. And that's where the investor state dispute settlement comes in. So even if fossil fuels are on public lands in countries like Canada and the UK and the US, we don't have state-owned oil companies as there is in a lot of places such as the Middle East. Instead, we have systems of licensing to basically give out areas of land for companies to do the exploration work on, and then to develop the deposit if they find something commercially viable. And then in a lot of countries, they don't use the licensing system. They use a contract-based system. But in both cases, whether you use contracts directly with investors or if you have auctions of licenses, in either case, these become investments that can be protected under these international treaties that I can explain in more detail. But basically, the treaties provide access to an international dispute settlement process called investor state dispute settlement. And so if you revoke a license, or even if you provide an exploration permit, but then you don't follow up and allow development when there's a commercial deposit found, then it's possible for an investor to argue that they deserve compensation.
Right.
And under a lot of national laws, compensation isn't required. In some jurisdictions it is, in some it isn't, and there's caps on what is provided. But in international investment arbitration, there's no real caps on how much compensation can be given, and so that's where the issue arises. Is that all of a sudden you're going to have, if we're talking about stranded assets, there's potentially a lot of assets that could be stranded by this kind of government supply side policy if we take climate change seriously, and then there's going to be demands for compensation, and if that ends up in these international arbitration processes, then the amounts of money involved could be very substantial.
Yeah, and hearing you talk about it, you're obviously an expert in this. It must be difficult when you're trying to communicate it to do so in a concise way that doesn't just overwhelm people, because you do sort of speculate on how the exhaustingly technical nature of it seems to also kind of serve the purpose of perpetuating it in some ways, and that there needs to be this sort of coalition of people that are not just raising awareness, but creating these ways of kind of thinking through tactics for negotiating it. So I just want to unpack this, right? In terms of the history of ISDS, investor state dispute settlements, you've written that the idea is that these treaties aim to promote investment flows between the state parties, but there is, you say, no consistent evidence that they actually achieve this. That's just kind of flatly stating, it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. You've described these settlements as secretive, exclusive, riddled with conflicts of interest, inconsistent, slow, and imbalanced. So, if it's the case that the ISDS system was, quote, designed to ensure stability in the investment environment, are there any valid reasons why they were established? How do they sort of position the importance, I guess, of investment and the problem, I guess, of regulation in the era of just contemporary global capitalism? There had to have been there has to be some rationale, right, for groups sort of supporting and buying into ISDS.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of the history, it's important to understand that these treaties, a lot of them go back many decades, and the original kind of push for investment treaties was, the immediate decolonial period, and this concern in the global north that that companies' investments in the global south were just going to be nationalized. So there was going to be a mine or something like that the government would just take over, and that was dovetailed also with a lot of, I think, influence from certain sectors, and the fossil fuel sector being one. Nicolas Perron's work has shown from archival studies and so forth that companies like Shell were really quite heavily involved in this system being developed in the first place. So you have a confluence of the sort of concerns about decolonization with, this sort of that general corporate influence that we get in there. So countries were pitched this sort of story that if you sign one of these, that'll help you to attract investment. There's also research that's been done by Lauge Poulsen that shows that a lot of countries just signed these as kind of like a diplomatic thing, like somebody was coming, they wanted to have a photo opportunity with them, and so they'd sign a bilateral investment treaty, and nobody thought anything of it because for a long time there weren't really any investor state disputes arising, and so
Right.
It didn't seem like a big deal to sign one. But then what you have happening in the sort of late 90s, you get the North American Free Trade Agreement signed, which is between Canada, the US, and Mexico. This has a chapter on investment, Chapter 11, which is essentially the same as one of these bilateral investment treaties, but it's just put inside a larger free trade agreement. And you have some creative lawyers who discover, oh, actually, these are pretty vague provisions in this chapter. I bet we could use these to challenge regulations. So not talking about a government actually, nationalizing an industry, but a government just putting in place some kind of policy that negatively impacts the profits of a company. Mm-hmm. And so you start getting those kind of cases, a lot of them about environmental regulation in the NAFTA context. And for the first time, you have these cases arising between two developed countries, Canada and the US. And this caught both of those governments off guard. And there's been people on the record saying, we didn't expect this investment chapter to apply to us at all. We put this in there for Mexico. And this is part of the history, right? There's always been a colonial thing. The courts aren't good enough in developing countries. The governments aren't reliable. We need this kind of international system to protect investors because we can't rely on them to do the right thing. Whereas in Canada, obviously, we have a great court system. US, we have a great court system. No one's going to sue us. But that is not what happened. Canada got sued quite a lot. Notably, the US has never lost a suit, but a lot of people think that that's entirely a political thing, that the arbitrators sort of recognized that if they did have a decision against the US, then the US would no longer support the system. And eventually we got the US MCA, the replacement for NAFTA. And what happened was that investor state dispute settlement was taken out between Canada and the US, but it was kept in there in a modified form for Mexico, specifically after lobbying from the fossil fuel industry. And Greenpeace actually caught, I think it was one of Exxon's lobbyists, in a secret video, basically saying that one of their big wins under the Trump administration was to keep ISDS for Mexico. Yikes. So you can see the corporate influence. You can see that whole north-south dynamic. And in terms of the evidence on investment flows, it's incredibly weak. There's been so many studies, and no one can really find solid evidence that these treaties actually make a difference when a company is deciding where to invest. However, once it's decided to invest somewhere, it may well structure its investment in order to take advantage of a treaty. So the treaty is not doing anything for the countries, but the companies are certainly, using them to their advantage, because it is quite easy for companies to have subsidiaries or mailbox in one country just to access a treaty.
Yeah, I mean, and it's wow, right? Like these are the sort of ripple effects in the present of these, inequitable rules that sort of codified, an imbalance, a kind of neoliberal imbalance of power. And it's, it's extraordinary to consider that these are like legally binding treaties, international treaties. Like that kind of thing is imagined to be inconceivable when it comes to like meaningful restrictions on fossil fuels to fight climate change. That's just a non-starter. Um, Even when governments don't cooperate, they can be hit with the obligation to pay compensation to companies. And it sounds like there were negotiations to some extent about these things, but not enough pushback was possible. And so there is this like substantive engagement in your work with like neoliberalism, neocolonialism, even if you're not exactly maybe naming these things as such. You're focused on the asymmetries that exist globally. So maybe we can pick up on that. Like you write that if left unchecked, ISDS could create a flow of finance from poor and climate vulnerable countries to private companies based primarily in the global north. It will also reduce the public resources in poorer countries that are available for mitigation and adaptation efforts, a just transition, remediation. The specific vulnerability of nations in the global south is this core part of your intervention. And I guess, you kind of spoke to it there, but why, from a global perspective, does energy transition need to concern itself with the effects of these legal structures on developing nations?
Well, I think if you look at where all the climate cases are happening right now, they are popping up in the global north. So we have, for example, Ruby River case here in Canada, where there was a proposal for an LNG facility that was knocked back for environmental reasons, as well as for concerns about Indigenous rights, and that's turned into a $20 billion NAFTA legacy case, because NAFTA doesn't live on, but some of the ISDS has a little bit of survival there. And then you've got the Keystone XL pipeline dispute in the U.S., which Biden famously canceled that pipeline, and that's being challenged. You've got some coal power plants in the Netherlands that objected to the phase out. You've got Italy actually was successfully sued by a company for banning offshore oil within a close proximity of the shoreline. So a lot of the cases are in the global north. The reason why myself and other scholars are concerned about the global south is sort of for several reasons. First of all, there are countries like Mozambique that have huge new sort of undeveloped gas reserves that companies are pouncing on. So the amount of potential liability if that country were to decide not to exploit those resources now that they've given out exploration licenses and so forth would be just so huge as to, in comparison to their GDP, just like there's no chance that the country would be able to manage facing those kinds of disputes. And the size of awards really is quite critical. Developed countries have good legal teams. They also have resources to pay off awards if they have to. But a country like Pakistan was successfully sued for almost $6 billion at the same time that it was facing a financial crisis and was getting a loan from the IMF for $6 billion. So how could you possibly expect Pakistan to be able to pay off that award? And so with these huge awards, as well as the general sort of lack of in-house legal expertise to fight these cases, the concern is that countries in the global south will choose instead not to go down the path of regulating for climate in a way that would spark such disputes, and that's called regulatory chill. So I mean, a lot of people would say, well, these countries are not, currently going down that path anyways. And part of that also is a justice issue. They've not had the opportunity to exploit their resources and to potentially benefit from the financial returns of exploiting those resources. Although I would say a lot of the times countries that have exploited their resources haven't really benefited from it either. But there is sort of a justice element to that. They haven't contributed to climate change the way the global north has, and yet they're sort of being asked to forego on development opportunities. But then if they do forego those development opportunities, they're potentially going to get hit with these claims from investors that are from the global north. So it seems like a double or even a triple injustice. The other aspect of it, in addition to having sort of new fossil fuel reserves that they might want to exploit, they're still more likely to be reliant on things like coal-fired power because it has, at least historically, been cheaper, and therefore the most for countries that don't have 100% energy access, and they want to prioritize trying to get energy access for impoverished parts of their country, which is a totally laudable goal. They've sort of emphasized coal power, which is one of the first things that really needs to be phased out because it is so such a dirty form of power. And countries in the global north have largely already gone through that transition.
That's right.
So even though we have identified coal-fired power plants in Europe, for example, that are incompatible with a 1.5 degree pathway, those plants tend to be much older than they would be in a country like Indonesia. And the newer the power plant, the more likely it's going to lose value if it's stranded, and therefore the more likely an investor claim is going to arise. So there's lots of sort of reasons why I think that the claims could be bigger in the global south, and those countries are just in a weaker position to deal with these disputes. And we, as a global community, can't afford for those countries not to be able to address climate change, because even though a lot of the historical emissions have come primarily from the global north, there is increasing contribution from the global south, and we need those countries to act as well. And we should be financing them in order to assist them in doing so, and not with loans, but with just straight up grants. So we're doing a poor job on climate finance generally, but I feel like the investor state dispute settlement system just makes it even worse.
Yeah, I mean, I was reading through the Routledge Handbook on the Green New Deal that you co-edited, and there is this sense that we have to obviously radically kind of change the economic system. I think the way you talk about it is like, the narrative is an economic one, not just because the economy is so central to society, but more crucially because it is our economic systems that fundamentally need to change if we are to avert ecological collapse. And there is this radical effort to keep open the possibility of that, real restructuring. But at the current moment, the coordinates of what is possible is it feels like your primary concern. And it feels like part of the point of your work then is to inform states, especially vulnerable states, about how to counter the claims of energy companies through a kind of determined and detailed understanding of what you call legal entanglements. I mean, this is maybe not exactly relevant, but the fact that, the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, considered the largest climate action bill in American history, requires the government to issue new oil and gas leases. To just dwell with that paradox. If the point is to raise awareness about the current and future use of these agreements to penalize states for taking action on climate by just, fighting pollution, decarbonizing the economy, I guess, do you have any sense of how your tactics of empowering people to understand these legal entanglements are being received? Do you feel as though there is a social tipping point happening in terms of greater knowledge of ISDS and attempts to combat it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's not hard to, once you explain this system to people, it doesn't take very much for them to be kind of shocked and disgusted by it. I mean, it's just it, unlike a lot of aspects of globalization, which seems sort of complicated, like trade agreements are quite complicated, and you can see sort of some benefits and some downsides. But investor state dispute settlement is just such a clear example of excessive corporate power that I don't think anybody people have a very hard time. I think the arbitrators and the lawyers that try to defend the system these days are trying to get on this. Oh, well, we need it to defend the renewable energy sector and have green transition. But those arguments are really, really frail because there's no evidence whatsoever that the agreements do anything to increase flows of any kind, let alone renewable energy. And studies that have been done interviewing renewable energy investors, they don't even think about these agreements. So, so I think it's not hard to get the public on your side. But I mean, the problem with many issues. I mean, first of all, you have so many competing issues, and climate has got so many fronts that we can fight on, obviously, and people aren't necessarily going to see why we should prioritize getting rid of ISDS. But I do think that climate, I mean, one of the reasons I started writing more about climate and less about investor state dispute settlement and environment more generally was because I feel like there's just much more potential within the climate movement to take on this issue. So even if the lay public still hasn't gotten the message that investor state dispute settlement is terrible, or even if they have gotten the message but they don't know what to do about it because it's hard to know what to do about these sort of arcane agreements, I think the climate movement really has, especially in Europe, done an amazing job of galvanizing action. And the specific example is the Energy Charter Treaty, which is a large agreement. So it's effectively the same content as any of these thousands of bilateral investment treaties that exist, but it's very big because it's got all the countries in the European Union involved, as well as Japan and some other countries. So it's 50 in total. And it's been sort of really targeted because a lot of cases have arisen, and a lot of fossil fuel cases in particular. So the one I mentioned about Italy getting successfully sued over a ban on offshore oil, that was under the Energy Charter Treaty. The cases about coal power phase out in the Netherlands, those are also the Energy Charter Treaty. There's a case in Slovenia about fracking and so forth. So there's a huge number of cases under the treaty, and a lot of them have to do with fossil fuels. And so the sort of a combined effort of a lot of environmental NGOs and sort of more specific trade justice advocates and so forth have been working together on this campaign on the Energy Charter Treaty for the last couple of years. And the treaty was undergoing this process of modernization, and because there was pressure to try to change it and make it more in line with the Paris Agreement, they came out with this proposal that basically was going to allow countries to carve fossil fuels out of the treaty, but over a rather extended timeline. And it wasn't something that all countries had to do. And so it was only really the European Union and the UK that were going to do this. And a lot of people came out and criticized the modernization proposal, and then they've just managed to put so much pressure on it that effectively now I think there's 11 countries that have officially already stated that they are withdrawing completely from the treaty, and the European Commission has also put forward a paper accepting that there's no possibility for the European Union to really stay in. So they're figuring out how to get out. The problem is that there is this clause in the treaty called a sunset clause, which exists in many treaties, which basically says that if you terminate the treaty, then for 20 years after that termination point, the investors that were already in place, the investments that were already in place are protected. So for 20 years, which in climate terms, we don't have 20 years to protect fossil fuel investors. So they're trying to come up with a way to get around that, and for countries to basically at least agree to cancel it within the European Union. They could cancel it among themselves and so forth. But it's, again, that kind of legal entanglement that even if you realize that a treaty is really harmful, it's not easy to get out of it. But I am really inspired by the work that has been done by those groups, because really prior to that, I didn't have a lot of hope. We did have the example of the multilateral agreement on investment, which got, was the sort of considered killing that was kind of considered the first success of the quote unquote anti-globalization movement.
Hmm.
But since then, we really haven't had a lot of progress. You get these fights that come up about big agreements like the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and
Hmm.
the TTIP, which was between the US and Europe. But all of these bilaterals, these little treaties, continue to exist and cause problems, and it's hard to generate any kind of mobilization around such a diverse group of countries and
Yeah.
treaties. But I feel like the Energy Charter Treaty example, if that treaty collapses, I feel like that will open up a lot of opportunities for getting rid of the system as a whole.
Yeah, there's sort of no time for pessimism. This is what Gernot Wagner, who's another kind of climate economist, said on my podcast, that there's a lot of things that I sort of, he and I don't exactly agree on. Like, I
Yeah.
think one of the things that I wanted to bring up was, your work and his work, while both focused on questions of whether, like, for example, the emphasis on economic growth
Mm.
can be continue to be normalized, like in a future of emissions reduction. Like, his feeling is that we're like wasting our time in having a conversation about growth, that in many ways, like, a regulated market will provide the kind of green growth that we need. And
Mm.
I don't think you see that at all. I think um, there's a different sort of, almost, I would almost describe it as a kind of utopianism in your work,
Mm.
or maybe if not utopianism, a kind of internationalism that reads as a bit utopian to me. Like you say in your article with Julia Calvert, for example, that international organizations can help democratize ISDS reform by creating new mechanisms for citizen engagement, promoting awareness of ISDS reform among citizens, and challenging assumptions about the economic necessity of ISDS. It's just not something that you're going to see in Wagner's work. And I guess the reason this isn't quite utopian per se is that you're also saying there are barriers to achieving that. I mean,
Yeah.
and we need to outline those too. These sunset clauses, for example, like, you can fight them with, if a state invoked Article 62 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, where states can terminate treaties if there's an unforeseen fundamental change of circumstances, like, that could fight the operation of sunset clauses. I guess the question would be, if we want to push for a future where fossil fuel companies are just refused compensation, and not allowed to create more assets because of all of the damage done and because damage that will be done, like, can we actually use articles like these and forms of international solidarity around the implementation of it to, like, normalize this idea of abolition? And is that so utopian?
Yeah, I don't think it's utopian. I think generally I would describe myself sort of as a bit of a pragmatist. So
Right.
um, I do think that the thing that frustrates me the most when I talk with government officials who actually, not so much politicians, but the people that are in the trade ministries and so forth, who are responsible for the day to day implementation of these agreements and for dealing with disputes that arise and so forth, is that
Mhm.
they do seem to forget that states are, the creators of these treaties, and ultimately they can be the destroyers of them as well. Like, there's a lot
Yeah, yeah.
more scope, a lot more power in states than I think sometimes that they remember themselves. And there have been countries that have just decided this system stinks and we're going to get rid of our treaties. And South Africa is an example that has done that. Some Latin American countries have gone up and down in terms of, as their politics go up and down in terms of rejecting these
Mhm.
treaties and even leaving some of the broader conventions that are involved with the ISDS system. Um, it's certainly not something that's impossible to achieve, and to some extent, I think the reason why I sometimes like focusing on ISDS is because I do feel like it's somewhere that we could actually have a win, and in the climate
Mhm.
sphere, you can get quite depressed and um, you can feel paralyzed sometimes by how much there is to do and how difficult everything is. And I feel like this is something that's achievable because although there are very powerful vested interests that want to keep the system, it doesn't really have any kind of other strong foundations to stand on. It has this myth about attracting investment, and I think if we can effectively destroy that myth, then that can help undermine the foundations of it. And I just see it as something that sort of is a little chip in the armor of of corporate power that we could foreseeably manage. So I like to try to chip away at it. But in terms of the other aspects that you mentioned in terms of degrowth and so forth, I think to some extent we shouldn't spend too much time debating green growth versus degrowth, and that we could instead focus on areas where we can agree it would be beneficial regardless of which sort of perspective you take. And for me, that the utopian ideas are really things around like, shorter working week. And I think a lot of people are naturally attracted to the idea of having more time, even if that means less money, and things that can sort of lead to potentially lead to a degrowth outcome, but without focusing on that as being the reason, just focusing on the other benefits that come out of it as well. So I suppose that is probably a bit utopian, but it is nice to also spend some time thinking about how the world could be a better place with climate action, rather than just focusing on how the potential negative futures that we face, especially when you deal with students every day, right? It's nice to nice to try to give them not false hope, but something to fight for.
Good hope, right? This idea of good hope. And in your chapter from the Routledge Handbook with Juliet Shore, you say like the simple point about growth is that it makes the very high mountain that we need to climb even steeper. Why rule out an important source of emissions reductions before we even get started? And you say like, I think this is hopefully increasingly the case, maybe especially after COVID, and one financial crisis after another, that the public seems to understand that growth does not necessarily yield well-being for the majority any longer.
Yeah. I mean, to look at the situation right now, I mean, the massive, increase in the cost of living for so many people, the fact that if the economy is doing well, what does it matter if the corporations are gouging everyone to the point where, and the people that are investments in real estate and so forth are all doing very well. But if everyday people are finding it hard to get by, then I think there is increasing understanding that inequality is what we should be concerned about rather than growth. But unfortunately, the reason why there's increased understanding about that is because inequality just seems to keep getting worse and worse.
Right. It's an emergency measure, and not necessarily, it's a different sort of utopianism. It's like a kind of mandatory utopianism that is just responding to disaster with a kind of radical hope. But you do say like there are other metrics besides GDP available. This is in your chapter with Sunyin Young and Ryan Gunderson, that, for example, New Zealand's well-being budget is something that we could maybe learn from.
Although I have a colleague who recently went to New Zealand to try to study that, and she didn't find much implementation, I don't think, of the budget, unfortunately.
Yeah, they don't.
But yeah, there are models for sure.
Right. It's like it's hard to legitimate something like the well-being budget when we have this like official sounding and very technical thing that feels more reliable, like GDP, even if it's not a measure of the well-being of a society. It's just, it has this kind of entrenched logic. But it's like, it's exactly that you're trying to, I think, find a language for contesting. I did appreciate that, like in the introduction to the handbook, you're talking about indigenizing the Green New Deal, and there are a lot of sort of recognitions of the contribution of like the Red Nation and the Red Deal as a document that is explicitly about like survival against capitalism effectively, and like this recognition, as you say, within the movement of the importance of indigenous knowledge about conservation, biodiversity, and reimagining the relationship between human and nature. In Canada, it was just the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. And if we wanted to talk about and address specific cases, you do talk about like instances of ISDS happening in Canada. There is also a growing sense of, I think, solidarity with Indigenous nations against extraction. Did you want to, would it be useful at all to kind of flesh out from your perspective, the shape of the climate struggle in Canada with regard to these sorts of like the exposing of these treaties and the kind of reconstitution of treaty relationships with Indigenous nations?
So I think, generally, I think that the aspect of extraction that you pointed out is really critical. I mean, if you look at extraction in Canada or really anywhere in the world, a large amount of extraction occurs on Indigenous territory, and it occurs without consent. And you can see in cases, really, like a huge number of cases have occurred because of hard rock mining done by Canadian mining companies around the world, and a number of them explicitly sort of deal with either Indigenous communities or just local communities that are Indigenous fighting back against that sudden imposition of an extraction project that they did not consent to. And there have been cases where there's actually been sort of protests, and you have the extractive companies bringing in security forces, and there being sort of violence occurring, and the state eventually sort of realizing that they need to stop this project because it's causing unrest. So a lot of these cases aren't necessarily about the government being so enlightened that they have decided to take action to protect the climate or action to protect the environment. It's about the government barreling on ahead with a project, allowing an investor to come in and do what it likes, and then being informed by the public that this is not what they want. And often It's being informed by the Indigenous communities that are being impacted. And then that results in an investor-state dispute after the fact. And then those communities and those Indigenous peoples have no involvement in actually, being able to defend, their rights and their concerns in the arbitration. It's just between the state and the investor. And so those issues of consent are really key, and there hasn't been there's no acceptance within investment arbitration of anything outside of investment law. So the UN Declaration on the Protection of Indigenous Rights doesn't come up at all on DRIP, and the idea of prior informed consent is not something that's written into investment treaties. And so the same types of issues, we haven't had a lot of cases directly over Indigenous concerns in investor-state dispute settlement. There have been some where, like the recent Ruby River case, where the proposed facility was rejected partly on the basis that it would have impacted First Nations. But a lot of the times it's just because the investor involved in the Canadian context is a Canadian investor. So the examples that most frequently come up are the pipelines that are being forced across Indigenous lands in this country. Some of them owned by the government and some of them owned by Canadian companies. So those ones don't end up in ISDS, but they are still equally concerning in terms of charting a path forward for both reconciliation, but also climate and environmental justice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the scale of the problem that you're outlining is obviously really staggering. You say over 55,000 upstream oil and gas projects in 159 countries are predicted to have a final investment decision made during 2022 and 2050. And there are all these bodies pointing out how these projects are being shielded by ISDS, and the IPCC has pointed this out. And you say that investors are being encouraged to anticipate the threat to their investments by climate action that's maybe hopefully going to be taken by states to reduce emissions if it's not prohibitively expensive, this sort of liability and especially the economic damages in the global south. I mean, it's a lot to wrap your head around. But what struck me was, so you're looking at how law firms are advertising this as a tool to aid lobbying, by fossil fuel companies. So it's like you're pointing out, like almost in this prophetic mode, like this is coming. Like as more climate action occurs, there is going to be a kind of backlash and compensation that will, slow down and even shut down that action. And so what struck me is how your research is anticipatory as well. In the same way that these firms are pointing out, hey, you better protect yourself. You're saying that, while right now we haven't seen a litany of cases by investors claiming that climate action is cutting into their profits, we should expect more to occur. And so this mode really appeals to me of kind of doing research. So I appreciate all the work that you put into it. And it's a pleasure to talk to you about it. And did you want to let people know like what you're currently working on or what they can expect to see in the future?
Yeah, so the most recent paper that I finished was for a special issue on supply side policies, and it's with some co-authors, and it's focused on that Italian case that I mentioned, where the offshore the ban on offshore oil was successfully challenged by a British company, and then also comparing that with a case here in Canada called Lone Pine, where an American company challenged a ban on gas fracking underneath the St. Lawrence River. That case wasn't successful, but there were still some aspects of the tribunal's findings that we find sort of quite disturbing, and so we were making arguments in that paper, basically about, it's more of a legal analysis than the sort of anticipatory work that you were talking about. But that will be coming out in a few months, and then I'm also working on an article about the Keystone XL dispute. This one I find really fascinating, just because I like unpacking the sort of claims that investors make about how they expected political stability, and they expected the rules would not change or so forth, while at the same time they're clearly investing so much time and energy into political lobbying to make sure that outcomes are favorable to them. So clearly they understand that these decisions are not made on a purely technocratic basis, and that this is all political. Climate action is political, and they're trying to influence the politics. But then when they're in these legal disputes, they're saying, no, it's not political. Governments should just make these decisions in a completely technocratic way. So trying to sort of unpack the kind of things that the company was doing in terms of trying to influence the political process in the U.S. In the Keystone pipeline dispute. I do also I'm generally fascinated with pipeline disputes. So, that's it for now. And then I am hoping to write sort of a more popular and digestible kind of explanation of the system when I get a little bit of time off teaching. So that'll be in the next year or so.
Yeah, I mean, it does take a lot of time to do the work of like awareness raising and trying to foster the sort of conversation that's needed, and I appreciate you making this time. It's really especially interesting, like the Lone Pine case, to think about the concerning findings around like labeling the government's decision making political, as though like that is a red flag. Just that question of the political here. The place of the political is interesting in terms of like the narrative, as it were. Whether to what extent like seemingly neutral phrases like net zero by 2050 resonate more than explicitly political statements about the kind of future we want to inhabit, is one that like I'm left with reading your work. So Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to chat. It was great.